Hi, welcome to another session here on the Expanded States of Consciousness World Summit. My name is Fleet Mall. I'm your co-host for this session, and I'm really thrilled to be here today with Ken Wilber. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, it's so great to be able to include you in this fascinating conversation about expanded states of consciousness and their potential benefits for healing and spiritual evolution and so forth. So I'm going to share a bit of your bio, and then we'll jump right into the conversation, okay?
Okay.
So Ken Wilber, a visionary thinker of inspired genius, is the developer of an integral theory of everything that embraces the truths of all the world's great spiritual, scientific, and philosophical traditions. He is most widely translated academic writer in America, with 25 books translated into some 30 foreign languages. Ken Wilber currently lives in Denver, Colorado, and is still active as a philosopher, author, and teacher, with all of his major publications still in print. Often referred to as the Einstein of consciousness studies, Ken Wilber is a preeminent scholar on the integral stage of human development. Ken Wilber is also the founder of the Integral Institute, which is the first organization fully dedicated to the advancement and application of the integral approach in relation to contemporary global issues. It was formed in collaboration with over 200 scholars and experts specializing in education, politics, business, medicine, psychology, spirituality, as well as law and criminal justice. In 2007, Wilber co-founded The Integral Life, a social media hub dedicated to sharing the integral vision with the worldwide community, as well as documenting and catalyzing the progress of the integral movement. So I think people can well understand why we're thrilled to have you be part of this summit, especially this day where we're really focused on what consciousness is. What do we mean by that? And what do we mean by expanded states of consciousness?
Right.
So Ken, perhaps before discussing expanded states of consciousness in particular, we could establish a working definition of consciousness for this conversation. So how would you define or describe consciousness generally, and how does an integral theory approach expand our understanding of consciousness?
Sure. Well, consciousness is our general ongoing sense of awareness. And that means an awareness of everything that's arising in our awareness, or in our consciousness right now. And so that includes objects, things, events, realities, and whatnot. And you can, generally speaking, the great wisdom traditions like Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism or Christian mysticism give 5 states of consciousness, and they're available in an expanding scale. So those 5 are the waking state, the dream state, the deep sleep or formless state, a state called Turiya Theta, and then one called Turiya, or one called Turiya, and then one called Turiya Theta. And Turiya simply means the transcendent witness. So that's something that can be aware of everything that's arising, but it can also be aware of our own mental states and our own interior awareness, and so on. And it also exists through waking, dreaming, and deep sleep awareness. So it can be aware of all of those. And then it can be aware of itself, or Turiya. And then the last and highest state is called Turiya Theta. And that simply means beyond Turiya. And what that means is we have a non-dual awareness that's arising and is aware of every state. So a non-dual awareness is aware not only of the objects out here and this computer screen and so on, it's one with the self that's doing the knowing. Mm-hmm. So I'm one with everything I'm aware of right now.
So
one of the sort of simplified ways of become aware of this non-dual state
Mm-hmm.
is to realize, as Douglas Harding put it, that we actually have no head. And what he means by this headless condition is that we'll notice we can be aware of every part of our body, but we can't really see our face. We can see like two little nubs sort of sticking out in awareness, but we can't really see our face. We can't see our head. Rather, we're in a headless condition.
Mm-hmm.
But where this head arises is actually all the objects out there. So when I look at like a tree or this table or this chair, it's actually arising right where I thought my head was. So when I'm looking at the computer screen, that computer screen is actually arising right on my headless condition. And I feel one with the computer screen because I can actually feel its oneness with all of my awareness. And so that's what Douglas Harding means by our headless condition. And it's fairly accurate. It's everything that's arising is arising in or directly on our awareness. And we don't feel any split or separation from anything. It's all arising right on our headless condition.
Well, that's a brilliant explanation of non-dual awareness. Very helpful for our discussion and very accessible. And also the 5 stages you laid out, wonderful landscape for our exploration today. Before we jump into expanded states, I'm just wondering, as you know, Western science tends to be more reductionistic. And at least in a more mainstream, they would regard consciousness as kind of an epiphenomenon of the neurological processes of the brain that somehow mysteriously arises. We don't know how it arises yet. They call that the hard problem of consciousness, right? Whereas in Eastern traditions, world wisdom traditions, sometimes almost assert a primacy of consciousness. Like there's consciousness and then there's the physical world. Right. And so you could think of consciousness is our awareness, as you described, but consciousness is something beyond that maybe what is really animating all of reality. I'm curious about your thoughts on that East-West kind of differentiation.
Yeah. Well, the simplest way to get a sense of what the East means by consciousness is to recognize that all awareness arising in our field of awareness is actually arising one with my subjective state. Mm-hmm. So it's arising right where my head was. And that's not a secondary or an epiphenomenon, because that awareness where my head was is actually one with everything that's arising. Everything is arising right in the space of my head. And that's an awareness that is one with the entire world. And that's not an epiphenomenon. That's not a side state. That's not one of 5 states of consciousness. It is consciousness itself. And so the pure awareness itself that's arising moment to moment is one with consciousness, one with awareness, and it's all in a state of unification with the entire world that we're aware of. And that's why Easterners make a big deal out of it. It's one with everything that's arising because it's the reality of everything that's arising. So consciousness really is a state of absolute, in a sense, awareness. Mm-hmm. And that is the foundation of everything that we're now aware of or conscious of. And so they divide it often into those 5 states because there are 5 different areas that we can recognize this consciousness arising. But in each case, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, turiya or turiya theta, when we're aware of something, we're one with that something. And we can feel that oneness directly. We can feel it arising right where our head used to be. And that's the fundamental reality that we're constantly aware of. And we can choose to be immediately aware of it or not pay that much attention to it. But it is the fundamental reality of everything that comes into our consciousness. So our consciousness is embracing everything that it's aware of. And that's, it's a important reality for the East. It's usually referred to as an absolute or ultimate reality. Mm-hmm. Because when we realize everything is arising right here, right where our head used to be, in our own pure awareness, then we recognize the genuine productive capacity of this ever-present, all-present consciousness. It's the actual reality of our world around us. And so that's what makes consciousness per se so significant or so important. It's the fundamental isness or thusness or reality of everything that's arising right now around us as far as the eye can see.
So let's begin to explore then expanded states of consciousness. And many people in expanded states of consciousness report having experiences or glimpses of this oneness or this kind of non-dual experience. And in this summit, we're exploring all the different vehicles human beings have been using for millennia and are using currently to access these states, whether it's psychedelic-assisted therapy, meditation, intensive breath work, shamanism, and so forth, and more, music and so forth. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, what the term, we used expanded states rather than altered states or not ordinary states, because even being drunk could be an altered state, but it doesn't necessarily have the potential for healing and transformation. So what would the term expanded states of consciousness mean to you? And how might we look at that through an integral lens? How could that help us kind of develop our understanding of it?
Well, in a sense, expanded means just that. It's a consciousness which is expanded. And usually that means, among other things, recognizing this headless or state of oneness that I can be in right now. As I see objects arising around me, as I see things and events arising around me, I'm realizing that they're arising within me. They're actually arising within my own consciousness or my own awareness. And they're arising, well, if you want, right where my head used to be. And so that's expanding my identity from being just this little awareness stuck inside my head to being a consciousness that's aware of, not only aware of everything I'm aware of right now, but is one with everything I'm aware of right now. So when I realize something is actually arising in here, one with where my head used to be, or one with this whole isness that I'm aware of, then that's an expanded state because it is a state of pure oneness. And I feel myself expand to include all objects and all things and all events that I'm aware of, because my consciousness is including all of them. And all of them are arising in my own headless condition. So they're present, ever present, and one with me. And when I feel that oneness, I feel my self-sense expanded from within my head or within my body to everything that is now I'm aware of. It's now entering my awareness. And I can feel that oneness directly. And I realize that oneness is because all consciousness is arising within me. So that expands my sense of awareness to everything that's out there, as far as I can see. The sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, this table, my body, this computer screen, all of it is arising in this fundamental oneness that I am. And that's a profound sense of oneness. It's a profound, real condition. And
so the consciousness that you're describing, which is, in a sense, self-aware and inseparable from the awareness itself, and it's always the case, but normally we're not experiencing in that way because we reduce things down to this kind of egoic consciousness, which sees itself as separate from that.
Right.
So these various vehicles, and I assume, are different means and ways in which somehow we dissolve or suppress or let go of that, and then we naturally are experiencing things as they are. It's not like we're creating something new. Now we're experiencing things as they are. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. And that direct experience of each and everything, just as it is arising, is felt to be arising within my own consciousness. Mm-hmm. So I can certainly see this table, but I can also feel my own oneness with this table because it's arising right where I thought my head was. It's arising within me in part of this huge awareness I have of everything around me. And I can feel that awareness, and I can feel myself being one with all of that awareness. It's coming in and sitting where my head used to be. And I can feel that oneness with all of it. And so that's a very profound, expanded sense of consciousness. And yes, most people don't recognize it. Although if I do something like pointing out their headless condition, they'll generally get a quick sense of that type of unity and how it's actually all arising within me. It's arising on top of me, if you want, or within my consciousness. And that's a type of expanded state that most people can recognize. And they can do it fairly quickly, just as they can also recognize that this expanded state of oneness is also one with all time. So it's a timeless here, now situation. And you can recognize the timelessness of this present moment just by simply thinking about anything that you think is past. So you might think about when you went to the grocery store yesterday, or when you went to pick up your kids, or whatever. You can think of some past event. And if you call that past event up right now, you'll notice that where it's existing is actually in the present moment. That's the only time you're actually experiencing this past memory. You can call it up, but when you do, it's sitting right here, right now. And so think of any past occasion you want, and it's an occasion that's occurring right now. And you can do the same with the future. You can think about any future event you want to, and that thought experience only arises right now in this present now moment. So being here and being now is your only choice to be in touch with a genuine reality.
So this Turiya Sita level that you're talking about, kind of this ultimate level, is really beyond space and time then?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure. But it's perfectly aware of all space and all time
right,
arising in this timeless now moment.
Well, it's very interesting, the analogy you're using, that kind of all this arising where our head was. I don't, maybe it's the same author. It's been a long time ago. I can't remember the name, but I read, it was an author writing about this kind of thing. And he encouraged us to just imagine just suddenly, like the back of your head fell off and you're just a two-dimensional pane of glass, essentially. Right. And you just immediately drop into this kind of either pure subjectivity or pure objectivity, or the two collapse. And it was like a simple pointing out. But if you're open to it, you suddenly find yourself in a different state.
Right. That might have been a guy by the name of Douglas Harding.
Could have been.
Wrote, he's a British Buddhist, and he wrote a book called On Having No Head. And that's what it's about. It's about, you really don't have a head. You can't see it. You can't actually feel it. You can't, in a sense, be aware of it. But everything that you are aware of is something that is entering your own consciousness, is entering your own being awareness. And that is arising right where you thought your head was. So he called it On Having No Head, because that's essentially what we have. We don't have a head that's sitting aside on this side of our face and looking at everything out there in a separate dualistic world. It's all arising on this side of our face, if you want, and it's arising in that headless condition, and we're one with all of that. So that is a very real oneness.
It reminds me a bit of the Heart Sutra, no eyes, no ear, no tongue, no mind, no body, the whole thing, right? Yeah. So let's look, if we could, at expanded states of consciousness from a developmental perspective. So I know in integral theory and your model, and you incorporate many models together, there's this idea that we move through different stages, sometimes described as the memes and spiral dynamics and so forth. And there's this idea of transcending and including as we go along. We're not escaping one to get to the other, especially from an integral perspective. We're bringing both the best of everything, transcend and include. And then in your Ockwell model, of course, not only do you look at all quadrants, all lines, all levels, but states and traits. And so these are state experiences, and how do we turn them into traits? So I'm wondering if you could talk about expanded states of consciousness, how they actually can lead to genuine healing, genuine transformation and awakening, through moving through these evolutionary stages, as well as somehow turning states into traits.
Right. Well, that is a sense of feeling this oneness that is an ever-present condition. Now, that oneness is usually described as being at least a third-person awareness. And all that means is first person awareness is pronouns such as I, me, mine, I, and so on. And that's our first person. It means the person who is talking. And right now, that would be me. So I'm aware of my I space. And the second person is the person you're talking to. So that would be you. And we have pronouns for you or thou and so on. And so there's an I and a you or a thou. And a third person is the person we are speaking about. So that's pronouns him or her or they or them. And our awareness can take in all three of those. And we can be aware of first person or second person or third person realities. And each time we become aware of one more of those realities, the more expanded our own consciousness gets. And so having a third person reality is really open to virtually any type of person you can see out there, because they're going to be a first person or a second person or a third person reality. And you can be aware of all three of those realities. So that's a very expanded state of awareness. And when you include all of those states, you're really in touch, in a sense, with as much of consciousness as you can be. So you're not just sitting back here identified with your head or what some sort of object you can see out there. You're really in touch with that second person object and that third person object. And you can be very much aware of real people in all of those spaces. And you can see real trees and real stars and real sky and so on. And those are all very real realities. And they're all resting on the foundation of your own awareness, the foundation of your own consciousness. Because that's where, when you say, I'm aware of that second person or that third person, that's where it's arising. It's arising in my awareness or in my consciousness. I'm aware of you, and you are arising in my awareness, in my consciousness. And so that's what makes you very real person to me. And especially as we converse and exchange viewpoints and so on, that I'm going to directly get to see your perspective, and I'm going to compare it with my perspective. So I'm going to have an I and a you consciousness. And then if we talk about somebody else, that would be a third person. And I can be aware of that person's perspective also. So we have these very genuine three-part realities of first, second, and third person. And those are all arising because we have a consciousness which can actually take that perspective, whether it's my own first person perspective or your perspective or that third person's perspective. I can take all of those perspectives. And so they're all going to be arising within me in terms of my own awareness. And that's what gives us a really big perception of the various realities that are out there and are available.
So that awareness, that ability to have awareness of these three different perspectives, is that what you might sometimes call kind of an perspectival awareness, or is it connected with the Turiya level, where there's that pure witnessing level? Maybe not the Turiya Sita, which is totally into non-duality, but it's right. Moving into that Turiya stage. Is that kind of...
Well, it does tend to get in touch with the Turiya stage, because as soon as you're aware of your awareness, which is an important exercise, particularly in the Eastern traditions. But as soon as you're aware of that awareness, you're aware of the first person, second person, and third person states of consciousness. And in that sense, it's aperspectival, in the sense that it's covering all of those perspectives. And it's not yet Turiyatita, as you say, but it is a Turiya. It is aware of the awareness that's arising. And then if you let that awareness become one with your consciousness, one with yourself, one with your own being, then you have a Turiyatita. Or I not only see this computer screen, I am one with this screen. And I'm one with you who are talking on it. And I'm one with the chair, and one with the room, and one with all the objects that I can be aware of right now. And they all are arising within my own present consciousness. That's where they are existing. And so when I'm aware of them, I can feel that oneness. And so I can directly become one with everything that's arising in my headless condition.
So, Ken, I'm wondering if, again, from a developmental perspective, you could talk about, because people often have these experiences, which could be Turiya or even Turiya Sita experiences.
Sure.
And yet then they come back into the first person perspective and kind of get locked in there in such a way that those experiences don't have a profound transformational impact, at least not then, or even worse, can lead to a kind of inflation of the self. And so how is it that we have these experiences, but then do the work to move in that developmental way and be able to stabilize it? Not that we're going to live in, live in the Triasita realm, but to live in the world and have that perspective in a transformational way.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that exercises like Zen Buddhism actually practice bringing about. So when you're practicing Zen Buddhism, you're taught to not think about anything in particular, or just let all objects arise as they want. And then you're further taught to be the oneness of all of those objects. So you let them all arise, but they're arising in your headless condition. They're arising within your own awareness. And when you actually have that conscious realization, in Zen, it's called a satori. So you actually have this satori oneness experience of being one with everything that's arising. That tends to be a very conscious state of awareness. And so you'll be aware of everything that's arising, and you'll be aware of your oneness with everything that's arising, but you won't tend to slip off that or slide away from it or sort of fall asleep while you're awake. You'll actually be very much aware of these third, second, and third person perspectives, but you'll very clearly be one with all of the objects that are arising in your consciousness or in your awareness. And that oneness is what provides you that overall unity or that contact with all of those perspectives. And that then tends not to die away because you've actually had it as a waking experiential oneness or a satori. And you've had that in a way that it tends to stick. You tend to be aware of that unity all the time. And that's what Zen Buddhism, of course, is about. And that's what satori means.
So, however one might be accessing expanded states of consciousness through whatever vehicles, it sounds like it's helpful to have some kind of meditation, mind training, contemplative practice to work with and integrate these things, and through practice turn states into traits and have this make a real difference in one's life.
Right. And I think that's actually, in a certain sense, it's sort of necessary. Because when you have a satori oneness experience, what you're feeling is that direct oneness with everything that's arising. You're directly aware of that feeling of unity. And so that's not just sort of letting everything objective come into your awareness and sort of be aware of first person and second person and third person and all of those things, which you can be aware of all three of those and still be separate from them. I mean, I can just be aware of you as the second person now, and I don't necessarily feel one with you. And it's true with any objects that are arising. We can look at all of them through first or second or third person perspective, but to actually be one with everything that's arising. So it really is arising within your own awareness, and it's something that you feel one with. That's a very important further expansion of awareness. And it's expanding into the state of oneness, which all of these perspectives are actually in. But for you to become aware of that as a direct unity is a fairly profound experience. And as I say, I think it's sort of necessary as a profound experience if we're going to directly experience all of that oneness that's arising around us.
Mm-hmm. So in the process, being able to have, these really powerful non-dual experiences and stabilize those is wonderful, but along the pathway, there's often, content that arises. And, from other models of consciousness and Jungian depth psychology, we have the idea of the collective unconscious. In Buddhism, you have the Alaya consciousness, maybe not exactly the same idea, but similar. And often in the dream state, in the 5 states you described before, a lot of that tends to arise, but it often arises with psychedelics and other plant medicines and other vehicles people use to access expanded states of consciousness. There can be all this, or the Bardo-like material, all this can arise, and you could just say, well, let's just transcend that and get to non-duality, but maybe there's some work to be done there in processing or healing some of that or seeing the emptiness within. Otherwise, we can kind of get stuck in some of the shadow stuff. I'm curious as your thoughts about all that.
Yeah, that's right. And we can be stuck in all of that objective stuff because we have not yet fully identified with the overlying ultimate unity or ultimate reality of all of these objective states. And we can have that experience of unity because it exists. It's, in a sense, already part of our unified oneness. And we can directly experience that oneness because it's lying there waiting for us to experience all of it. And if we don't, then we can get caught in all of it. We can get caught in all these objects arising in our awareness and so on. And that's because we've not yet realized the profound unity of all of these objects. There's a profound oneness or unity awareness lying at the foundation of our consciousness or awareness. And that's why all of those different states are also available to us. We can have an experience of the Bardo realm, or we can have an experience of unity consciousness, or we can experience the Alaya Vijnana. I mean, these are all possible realities that are already one with us, and therefore we can experience that oneness. And that's a good thing, basically, because we're really uncovering our fundamental reality, what we actually are. And that isness, that thusness, is already existing right now. And we can directly experience that. And so that's a very important expansion of consciousness. And it's real because it's a fundamental reality that's a part of all of us.
And so this expanded consciousness that we're talking about, in some ways, you could say it transcends, some level being locked into any particular perspective, but it also includes everything. Is that fair to say? We're not rejecting anything. It includes everything.
That's right. So I sometimes say it's to transcend and include everything, because that's what it does. It goes beyond certainly any individual reality we feel or any individual unity we feel, but it transcends all of that. So it includes everything we're aware of right now. And that includes different states of consciousness we have aware of us. So we can have a transcend and include experience of the Alaya or of Jungian collective consciousness, or with a waking dream or deep sleep consciousness. We can transcend and include all of those into a genuine, ultimate sort of unity experience.
So let's talk about these expanded states as a vehicle for not only spiritual growth, maturation, development, but also even what we call awakening or liberation. And you somewhat reference this with the kind of Satori experiences in Zen. But I know there was a writer who wrote a book about, he did a scholarly study on early Chan Buddhism, and he argued that the only place you can really see liberation is in the relational field. How does it show up, right? And so when we talk about, enlightened beings and like we generally talk about things showing up like compassion and altruism and generosity and these kind of things. And so how does these expanded state experiences and having some experience of oneness, of non-duality, of these different, developing a greater capacity for meta-awareness, that witness, all these things, how does that then translate into someone showing up in their life with greater altruism, greater generosity, compassion, and so forth?
Right. Well, the general idea is you can feel those types of expanded states if you have a constant awareness of their unity. And the same is true of compassion or mercy or consciousness or awareness. It's a direct experiential unity experience. And so whether we're having an experience of compassion or mercy or collective consciousness, it doesn't matter. It's going to feel fundamentally whole only if we directly experience that fundamental unity lying at its foundation. Because that's what wholeness means, is to feel everything, to transcend and include everything. And when you do that, an intense experience of wholeness or unity or awareness will come over you. And that's simply uncovering the unity that each of those states are in themselves. So each of them are lying on a bedrock of unitary awareness. And that's what their reality is. And we can directly experience that reality by experiencing that real unity or wholeness, which each of them brings.
So, we're in the midst of what many are calling a psychedelic renaissance, and I've done a lot of research into it. We did an earlier summit on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And it is I was very much involved in that movement back in the 60s and 70s, as many of us were of our generation. And it is a much broader movement now, and it seems to be a lot more thoughtful. There's amazing organizations really kind of trying to do it right this time in terms of, so I'm wondering if in terms of where you see the integral movement today, if there's a confluence between where the integral movement is going and this emerging psychedelic renaissance and the tremendous interest in expanded states altogether, whether you see a confluence of all these things that are kind of occurring now. There's a landscape. It's interesting because if you watch the news, and the mainstream is still very caught up in the extremes of postmodernism and, and all the cultural wars and all of that. But there also seems to be this other thing going on that's quite strong. I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah. I think the alternative, fairly strong movement is a current that's sort of out there, and it's available to us. And it's available because it does represent a very real reality. These unity states or consciousness states or mercy states or whatever we want to call them. And they're very real. And they're very ever present, and they are an awareness of this infinite here and this eternal now moment. And because those are already part of our reality, we can plug in to any of them that we focus on clearly. And that means whether doing Zen or doing other sort of awareness practice, these are all available to us. And I think that's a very important insight, is that we can not only sort of be aware of first, second, third person, Turiya, Turiya Theta states, but we can directly experience a oneness with each or all of these states of consciousness. They're real, they're fundamentally whole, and they can be experienced as such. And every time we do that, we add a sort of layer to our own awareness, a layer of wholeness, a layer of being, a layer of thusness or isness or suchness. And these are very profound experiences. And once we sort of have a direct experience of one of these, then we will tend to just stop staring around at all the objects in our world. Yeah, I can see all that. Yeah. And it's, oh, wait, that's arising right where my head was. I'm one with that. Wow, I get it. And so all of a sudden, everything comes rushing in. And all of these objects running around out there just fill you up. And you can feel a wholeness with all of them. And then you're feeling a oneness with the entire universe. And that's a magnificent, extraordinary feeling. And it's an extraordinary experience and an extraordinary awareness. But it's right there. It's just sitting in our awareness right now. And we can experience it by experiencing this, our ever-present, headless oneness experience. And that's all arising right here in this now moment. And it's a unified whole, and it's one with everything that we can be aware of, that we can look around and see. And it's all there. I mean, there's nothing to keep any of it out. So that becomes an extraordinary experiential realization.
And although some expanded state experiences can be quite dramatic, a lot of fireworks, and, you could even kind of at some point, even the ability to witness it seems to dissolve. And, right. Then if it is a psychedelic journey, eventually you come back. And if you let go, you don't freak out. You have this incredible journey, you come back. But when we talk about awakening and living an awakened life, that same very expanded consciousness, there's something about it becoming more ordinary, right? There's something about it becoming that is ordinary mind. So it's not like we're walking around on a psychedelic journey all the time, having visions. It's more like we're just relating with reality as it is, but somehow that's very different than the more egoic, dualistic way we were relating with it. Is that fair to say?
That's right. That's right. And it starts out by us becoming aware of a wholeness that's existing right now in our immediate awareness. Mm-hmm. And so just as a few minutes ago, we talked our way into being aware of a present now moment that was everything that's arising, but right now. And once we start to be aware of that type of wholeness, and we can start to integrate it or feel one with this wholeness, then we start to recognize that it's always been there. We realize, oh, I'm not just thinking about yesterday, and therefore I'm becoming aware of it now. It's every thought I have is arising in this timeless now moment. There's nothing I can do to get away from it. And so you start to realize this extraordinary oneness that you were becoming aware of is actually a oneness that's ever present. And it's always present. And just when you actually see this oneness, you'll start to see that you're experiencing it directly now, and that it's always been present directly now. And once you see that it's always present, that does tend to take on a fairly ordinary form. Because we'll notice that, well, wait, I can certainly feel oneness with all of this, but then it's not a mind-blowing experience. It's just all of this ever-present reality. There it is. It's arising right here, right now, in my headless condition. So I'm aware of everything that's arising. And that can take on some very ordinary dimension, because it is, in a sense, a quite ever-present and therefore ordinary state. And it sort of becomes a sort of ordinary experience for you, and something you'll sort of be aware of as being this ever-present, extraordinarily ordinary condition. And that doesn't stop you from having occasionally really far out experiences of being one with everything, and it kind of lights up and it's sort of psychedelic and all of that. That's fine, but that's not the ordinary condition of this extraordinary unity that we have. The ordinary condition is, oh, there it is.
Interestingly, what the research going in with psychedelic assisted therapy in particular, and to some degree with psychedelics and plant medicines, is that they all operate differently, but there seems to be a dampening or suppression of a set of neural networks in the brain known as the default mode network that seems to be responsible for a lot of creating that illusion of having a head, that constant self-referencing and the constant ruminating about me, what others think about me, my past and future, that whole thing that keeps reinforcing that creates a lot of our suffering and stress. It seems that some of these medicines and psychedelics tend to repress that, and thus we're able to relax into or open into this, what you're calling this kind of headless condition. Right? Yeah, quite.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, in the first part, it's very true that this constant referencing of our head, so to speak, this constant referencing of there being something inside here that's looking at all of that. And this inside part of me can get hurt or abused or misregulated, or something horrible can happen to it. And that's why I'm always sort of afraid of being stuck in this headed condition. But as I start to experience the greater wholeness and greater unity of it all, then I realize I really don't have a head. And that's nothing to worry about. It's actually, fine. Okay, there it is. Oh, it's exactly next to that object and that table and that tree. And they're all just arising right in here. And that's fine. I've got nothing to worry about. And so that does give a certain sense of release, because you no longer feel trapped inside this head or inside this body or inside of this awareness. There's just a complete falling off of all self-identity. And you just expose yourself to the full wholeness of everything that's arising around you. So and that's a very comfortable, wonderful feeling.
Absolutely. And you spoke to the fear that arises when we are locked into that separate self-sense, self-referencing, having a head, seeing the world from inside here somewhere. Then we have the fear of all the things that can happen to this thing, whatever it is. And it would seem that, most of our behaviors in the world that are creating struggles and problems and so forth are really come out of fear. When we don't have fear, humans behave pretty well absent fear.
Right.
So it seems that these experiences really do address that fundamental problem of fear, and probably even address the fundamental fear of death in some way.
Yeah, that's very true. One of the things that you drop when you drop your head is you drop all fear of dying. Because when there's just nobody here, it doesn't matter if this exists or doesn't stand out and exist, or if I can't feel my head or feel my body. It just all has let go, and we're just floating, as it were. And we can do that whether we're alive or dead or in a waking or dreaming or deep sleep state. And that condition is a genuine sense of freedom. And that's what we feel, is a genuine, incredible sense of openness or freedom from being stuck anywhere in this individual body mind. Mm-hmm. And so we can even begin to think of dying or death, and it's not that frightening, because it's just an opening into this extraordinary expanse that's already there, and I can already be aware of that extraordinary expanse. And whether I die and expand into all of that expanse or continue living and expand into all of that expanse, there's still just all of that expanse. And that's what's real. And that's what I'm directly aware of when I become aware of this headless, unified sense of wholeness that I have. And so death is not that special a deal, mostly because it's not separated from any of the realities that I'm aware of. There's just an ultimate degree of absolute wholeness or oneness. And whether I am aware of that, or whether I fall into that, or whether I die, in a certain sense, it really doesn't matter, because there's nothing to experience my head. There's nothing to experience my separate self condition, because there's no separate self. It's really just not there. So I can relax very easily into that condition.
Mm. So, Ken, we're kind of nearing the end of our time here, but I'd like to take one last question to kind of extrapolate this out a little bit. So, we're living in some pretty challenging times. We have the existential threat of human-caused climate change and increasing cultural and political divisiveness, polarization, the rise of authoritarianism, ongoing wars, you name it. Really challenging. And there's so many of us on the planet that we're up against some real limitations. And it would seem that we really do need a very significant collective shift in consciousness if we're going to be able to come together and solve some of these problems. And right now, it seems like we're too locked up in the culture wars and all the rest of it to even come together to address it. Yeah. And it seems what's really needed is in your language of integral theory, is that shift to second tier thinking, where we begin to bring forth the best in everything. We get out of the culture war mentality. We get out of being right, and we get into, this expanded awareness and expanded heart, if you will. And so I'm wondering if you see the possibilities here. We're talking about there's a bit of an alternative movement that has some momentum, and whether there could be enough going on that we might be able to see that those tipping points into a kind of second tier consciousness for enough people that it would begin to shift things. I'm just curious whether you're feeling hopeful about that, not so hopeful. It's
yeah. In a certain sense, I'm not as hopeful. Mm-hmm. And that's only the sense, not that we can't have those experiences, or not even that they aren't already part of our present reality, but it's that so few people become actually aware of that ever-present reality. You don't hear it as much of a conversation, or you don't hear people saying, oh, you've experienced your own huge wholeness, right? It's just not a commonly, it's almost impolite to bring it up.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, I'm a little bit pessimistic because I really don't meet a lot of people that have had this simple, ever-present, experiential oneness. There just aren't that many people that have had that kind of Satori awakening. Of course, I meet them in a lot of my Zen Buddhist friends and a lot of my Christian mystic friends and so on. But for the average everyday person, it's just not even a reality. They just don't think about, oh, I'm walking along the sidewalk here, and the sidewalk is separate and apart from me, and I'm looking at it in an objective way. But I could be one with it if I really opened up my mind, lost my head, lost my separate self-sense, and just became one with all of that pavement. But they don't think that way very often, even though they could do that. And so the fact that they can do something like that, that part is the encouraging part for me. Because when we do become aware of a Zen Buddhist Satori, if we do become aware of a Christian mystic unity experience, if we do become aware of a Buddhist enlightenment, then we generally tend to want to experience those things. And if we have that kind of desire, then all we need to do is look around for a few type of methodologies or experiential realities or practices and so on that can actually point out that we do have this sense of oneness. It's arising within us and around us and arising everywhere, basically. And we can be aware of that wholeness or that oneness or that unity. And when something like that happens, that's really good news because it means somebody else has realized their own fundamental unity. And so that, in a sense, they've had a spiritual experience. And that is terrific as far as I'm concerned. That's great. And the more people that have those type of experiences, the better off it is for everybody. Because when you realize your fundamental oneness with the entire world, then you do just tend to drop away from any separate self-sense or any small self or any detached, objective or subjective or dualistic experience. It just tends to fade away. And that's a fantastic realization to have. And you can, of course, interpret it in most of the religious languages that you want to. You can say, oh, I'm one with everything. I'm one with God. I'm one with Buddha. I discovered my Buddha nature, or so on. I mean, almost any of those forms can be used to discuss this genuine, unified state of wholeness that we awaken to or fall into or become aware of. And that's terrific. Fortunately, again, it just isn't that common a discussion or that common a sense of experience.
And we don't, in the West, we don't really have a strong cultural framework or language to support that. Perhaps they have had that more in the East, in Indian places and Tibet, where, although the monoculture is impacting the whole world now. But my own personal, I share your pessimism. I also have some optimism, and I guess my optimism goes in line. I see the Great Pope as more and more people getting a sense, not only having these experiences, but getting that kind of that integral view, that integral consciousness. And
Right.
for people that pursue that, I really encourage people just to, people can just look up Integral Institute or the social network and platform, Integral Life. But if there was one of your many books that if someone's going to want to begin to understand something about integral theory as it relates to consciousness expanded states, is there a book you would point them to, any particular one?
Yeah, I guess there are a couple. Probably one of the simplest ones is a book called No Boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the best written and sort of most inclusive books I've written is A Brief History of Everything. And it's a fairly comprehensive understanding. And then I just finished writing a book, which I think is one of the best inclusive statements I've ever done. And it's going to be called something like Making Room for Everything. My publisher wants to call it something to do with radical wholeness. And I really can't say right now. I think it's going to be a radical wholeness. So I would recommend looking at something like that. But it's one of the best books I've done. And I've just completed it. I just finished writing it. So it'll be out fairly soon.
Well, I'm really looking forward to that. And I know No Boundaries very well and A Brief History of Everything. I know those books very well and right. Your work, and really grateful that you gave us. I know you've been very busy completing that book, so I'm very grateful you were able to set aside time to be part of our summit. And I hope we are getting this message out to more and more people. And on some level, maybe we're preaching to the choir a little bit, but maybe we're unifying the choir so it can have a bigger impact. And then tangentially, more people will hear about these things and get interested. But thank you so much for your contribution to our summit, Ken, and really wish you all the best.
Thank you enormously. It was a great conversation, and I appreciate getting a chance to talk about these things. So thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Be well.
Okay, bye-bye.